Good morning. My name is Glenn Miller with the Canadian Urban Institute. My pleasure to welcome you to the third Placemaker session of the year. If you missed the first one, you weren't out in Vancouver in January. We are very pleased that you all found this place. I know it's a challenge. We decided that if you were able to make it here, then you were going to be able to make a very good contribution to the debate, because obviously you have high intelligence to be able to find this place. So before I introduce our conference moderator, Paul Bedford, I just want to remind you that the Canadian Urban Institute is a membership organization, and all of those of you who are members of the Ontario Professional Planners Institute will be able to use this for your continuing professional learning credits. And we have in the audience a past president of OPPI, Tony Usher. So, Tony. And who's sitting next to Rob Dowler from the Cabinet Office. So we are in august company. And we also have people from across the Golden Horseshoe, and including Mike Murray, who's on our board, standing at the back. Very pleased that he could be with us. And today, this session, we have to thank Neptis for their financial support to help make this happen. And the session is going to be videotaped, which will be available through links on various websites afterwards. So our moderator today is Paul Bedford. People say, oh, people who don't need introductions, and then introduce them. So I'll tell you very briefly, Paul is former chief planner with the City of Toronto, and most recently, having had a spell on the Metrolinx board, participated in the transit panel that reported just before Christmas, and he's a senior associate with the Canadian Urban Institute. I'm going to ask him to come up and start the proceedings. Paul Bedford.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks very much, Glenn. This isn't the greatest of rooms, but we're going to have a lot of fun, and I'm going to expect a hell of a lot from this audience. Okay, this is a special day for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's the 180th birthday of the City of Toronto, so happy birthday to the city. And the main reason for today, of course, is this is a unique opportunity to take stock officially of how's the growth plan working? What's been accomplished? Are we getting anywhere? What's wrong with it? What should we do to fix it if there are problems with it? There's a lot of questions that I have, and I'm sure members of the audience have, because we've all had experience with it now for several years. So to help us answer those questions, I can think of no one better than Marcy and Philippa, who are here to give the keynote presentation. And I just want to briefly introduce them. And many of you have had the pleasure, I'm sure, of reading the Neptis paper that they put out on the growth plan, which is very constructive, hard-hitting, some people say, but very positive in many ways. Let me introduce Marcy first. She is now the executive director of the Neptis Foundation, and she has been with Neptis since 2001. She had a former career in the city of Chicago, which I didn't know, which is very interesting, and graduate from University of Toronto. And Neptis, I think, has a well-deserved reputation for producing very high-quality papers on current issues of the day. They produced another one, many of you know, on the whole transit debate, the transit question, which could be the subject of another session. So I'm really looking forward to Marcy's keynote. Philippa is also going to join Marcy in that, and I asked her this morning how'd she want to be introduced, and she said basically just say I'm an adjunct professor, graduate program, University of Toronto, program in planning, and obviously also a senior associate of the Canadian Urban Institute. So I'm not going to say any more now. We have lots of time for conversation. I want to invite Marcy and Philippa to come up, and please give them a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Paul. And I'd like to thank Glenn and Gretchen and the CUI for helping to put this together today. And of course the panelists and Paul Bedford for what I hope will be a lively panel discussion after our presentation. I'd also like to thank the audience members for taking the time to come out to what I hope to be one of many discussions on the effectiveness of the growth plan as we approach the 10-year review. So getting growth planning and growth management right is essential for the success of our region. And although it may not be as high profile, land use planning is the other side of the coin to regional transit planning. It is important that we examine the plan and its companion plans, the Greenbelt Plan and the Big Move, with a thoughtful, critical eye and ask ourselves what's working and what's not working. So I'm here today to set the context for why Neptis funded this important research project. And it is a project that started out really with the creation and construction of a data set. It transitioned into a report, and it culminated in the Neptis GeoWeb, a web-based mapping application that will allow people to visualize how the region will grow and change over time. And this is a product we're actually launching this afternoon, so please keep an eye out in your email for that announcement. So after I set the context of the research, Philippa will then present the main findings. She's the co-author of the report with Ryan Allen, who is also here today. So most of you know who the Neptis Foundation is. We're a charitable foundation. We use our funds to conduct and commission nonpartisan research on urban growth management issues. Our focus has been mainly Toronto. We've done some comparative work with other Canadian cities. We focus on land use and transportation relationships. And finally, our research really examines the regional scale. It's that sort of big picture view of issues, which at the time of the founding of the foundation was really missing. Neptis is also, I just wanted to make people aware that Neptis is also seeking some feedback on research topics and areas where folks still think there is a gap in quantitative data and information. And we've recently sent out a survey to sort of thought leaders in this area to ask for their ideas on shaping our sort of midterm research agenda. So I encourage you that if you haven't received that email, that you get in contact with us and share your ideas. So I'm going to start by setting the context of the research by harkening back to the late 1990s. At this point, regional growth coordination had fallen by the wayside, and urban planning remained the domain of municipalities since the 1970s, late 1970s. Each municipality focused on its own priorities, and by the late 90s, the word sprawl had begun to characterize urban growth in the Toronto region. And at this time, there was no real comprehensive understanding of urban growth patterns in the region. But there were very tangible consequences and signs of negative effects of rapid, uncoordinated growth. As you can see here, increased congestion, longer commute times, increased air pollution, rapid loss of agricultural land. And I think to note, that an important note is the beginning of the crisis of financing growth and its infrastructure and the awareness of municipal debt in this area. By 2001, the concept of smart growth took hold in the region. And there was a general consensus around, after 30 years, a coordinated regional role, I should say, to growth management was needed. And at the time, a stakeholder panel was formed, led by Her Worship Hazel McCallion, and its members represented by diverse interests, some of who are here actually today. There were many people from many different political stripes, many different interest groups, developers, politicians, university professors, environmentalists, and highly esteemed members of the public service that all served on this panel. And it was, Neptis was actually involved in this panel. In cooperation with the Government of Ontario and with the capable hands of Pamela Blais, we coordinated and provided the panel with research issue papers that informed their thinking around the growth challenges and opportunities. And it was my early days at the Neptis Foundation. I was sort of the proverbial fly on the wall, watching this panel and its deliberations. And what was amazing to me was the buy-in from this very diverse group of folks that something had to change, and some sort of regional coordination of growth was required. And it is through this consensus on the need for change that led to the creation of the big plans that we have today. The growth plan, the Greenbelt plan, and the big move. So the growth plan was really meant to change the shape of growth, to move us away from the business as usual growth patterns of the 70s and the 80s and 90s, and to develop more compact mixed-use patterns. Its policies were meant to mitigate against sprawl, loss of agricultural land, and to encourage municipalities to grow more smartly and sustainably. Yet soon after the growth plan was enacted and municipalities started down the path of this conformity exercise to the growth plan, a number of things happened. One was Amendment 1 to the growth plan, which essentially gave special treatment to Simcoe County, where growth pressure was greatest. And the amendment showed a disconnect, really, between the plan's overall goals and specifics in the amendment. Specifically, as an example, the plan promoted contiguous growth, and the amendment allowed for discontiguous highway access-only employment areas. And then there was an Amendment 2, which focused on new growth forecast to 2041. And at this point, we asked ourselves, why are we planning for more people and jobs before we understand whether the policies in the plan were affecting change or not? And so finally, we noticed that it was not easy to grasp how the plan was being implemented at the municipal level. Implementation was done through amendments to the municipal official plans, and there are over 100 of those in the region. There was no formal tracking of the plan's implementation or regional coordination of information. And finally, there was a lack of transparency and very limited access to information on how the plan was being implemented. So we started our inquiry into the implementation of the plan, and our research was guided by three main questions. How much land was designated for growth? And this first question relates specifically to that data set that I referred to earlier. Secondly, how much change had municipalities made in planning for growth through the implementation of the growth plan? And lastly, how has the growth plan actually reduce the amount of land designated for growth compared to earlier estimates? And here I refer to our business as usual study from 2002, one of a few studies that happened at the time that looked at the projection of growth of people and jobs over 30 years' time if we continue to grow in the same growth patterns of the 80s and 90s. So what did we do? And this is a shameless plug for the GeoWeb. This is sort of what it looks like, and this is what will be launched this afternoon. So what we did was we reviewed 87 of the 110 official plans to better understand the implementation of the intensification targets, the greenfield density targets, and the amount and location of land designated for urban growth before and after 2006. We mapped that designated growth, as you saw here, and we tracked exemptions to the plan as they were allocated to, since exemptions to the targets were allowed for many municipalities. And finally, we created a database and analyzed the numbers, and all of that information is actually accessible on our website. So now I'll turn it over to Philippa to talk about the main findings.
So we're going to talk about 5 big issues. It's a huge report. There's a lot of material in it, but we selected 5 things we thought would be good to stimulate discussion today. And I'll go through each one. But first, just to review, many of you are terribly familiar with how the growth plan works, but some of you may not be quite so familiar. So this, through the magic of graphic design, looks terribly simple and straightforward, but anybody who's actually been through this process knows it's extremely difficult. What happens first is that the province sets population and employment targets. They take the region as a whole and they allocate those targets to all of the 21 single and upper tier municipalities. Upper tier municipalities then have the job of assigning that population and employment forecast growth to their lower tier municipalities, 89 of them. So at that point, you've got figures for how many people you expect to see in different areas. Then you have to think about residential intensification. Residential intensification is the only type of intensification that the plan deals with. Commercial is not part of that issue. And it's measured not in people, but in units. Well, we think it's units. Actually, the growth plan says 40% of residential development shall be within the built-up area, which we assume to mean units, but it could mean something else. So you translate that into units, and you place 40% of the units inside the built-up area, and the province has established a built boundary for municipalities that represents the built-up area. Then, theoretically, 60% of them go outside into the area considered the designated greenfield area, which is also delineated on a map. That's not measured in units, though. That's measured in people and jobs per hectare. Now, employment makes things a little tricky. Employment is notoriously difficult to measure. It's also notoriously difficult to plan for and to be assured of receiving. You can plan for it, but you may or may not get it. The target in that respect is set at 50 people and jobs per hectare. That figure was chosen because it relates to transit supportive guidelines. 50 people and jobs per hectare is considered to be a density at which you can have some sort of minimal level of transit, such as a bus every half hour. Not higher order transit, but some minimal level of transit. So placing all these things on the map is not an easy matter at all. And the people who have been through this process of conforming to the growth plan have encountered a lot of difficulties with it, which is one of the reasons that it's taken so long. The growth plan is not in effect throughout the region to this day. And the other reason, of course, is the OMB challenges. The first thing I'm going to talk about is actually one of the last things that we discovered, because Ryan spent more than a year studying municipal official plans, plotting where they were going to grow, how much land they had already developed, how much land they had already designated before the growth plan came into effect, and then how much land was designated after the growth plan came into effect for urban expansion. And when all of that was done, we were in a position to total it up. And we came up with this figure of 107,100. And to be honest, we were gobsmacked. We were gobsmacked partly because it was so high. We hadn't actually thought it would be that high. But what was even more surprising is how it bore an uncanny resemblance to the amount of land predicted in the business as usual study. So that was a 2002 study. Very different, slightly different boundaries, but it encompassed most of the Greater Golden Horseshoe. It was a modeling study based on a series of assumptions, and the idea was to project out in as much as possible a straight line what would happen if we continued to develop the region at the pace and in the way we had been doing it during the 80s and 90s. And the total turned out to be almost exactly the same. In fact, I think it was 1,006,900, but it was very, very close. So now the good news here, there are all these differences, of course, but the difference between our figure and business as usual figure is that our figure simply says this amount of land has been designated. Whereas the business as usual was a little gloomier because it said this amount of land will be built on by 2031. All we can say is this amount of land has been designated. One hopes it will last a bit longer. Maybe we won't need all of the land we've designated. Another thing we found as we went along is that there had been a number of exceptions granted. Now, this is a diverse region, and you would expect to see differences. The province did not impose a one-size-fits-all approach, and that makes a lot of sense because some of these are very rural areas and some of them are very heavily urbanized. So under certain circumstances, municipalities in the outer ring, there's a heavy black line indicating what's the outer ring and the inner ring, could lower the targets. So they could aim for less than 40% intensification or fewer than 50 people plus jobs per hectare in developing their greenfields. So on the left you see the intensification target. The ones in yellow are the people who are meeting the minimum target. The two in green are two stalwart souls who are going to aim even higher. And the ones in the sort of pinky orange are people who have applied for and received permission to aim lower than the target. And I think the lowest one of all is 15% intensification, but they range from 15 to 30% intensification for most of them. On the right are those that have asked for and received permission to have lower targets for density in developing their greenfield areas. And even more of them seem to be in that category. They range from, I think, a low of about 20 people plus jobs per hectare, and there are some that are 30 and some that are 40. And remember that the 50 figure was chosen because it was supposed to be transit supportive. So these people have been allowed to grow at less than transit supportive levels. The patchwork's kind of odd when you focus in on it. We don't know the reasons for those decisions or why those particular numbers were chosen for the particular places. We've seen correspondence from the Minister of Infrastructure that simply says you have permission to use an alternative target. But we have not seen documentation, which may well exist, but we haven't seen it, that says this is why we're granting you this exemption and here's why this number is being set at this level. And one of the interesting examples is that two of the outliers are in fact neighboring municipalities. There's Waterloo Region, which intends to exceed the targets. They're aiming for 45% intensification and 55 people and jobs per hectare. Brantford, however, is a rather different case. As you can see, Brant County, Brantford is a separated city within the county of Brant. And because it is not part of the county of Brant, it is possible for the county of Brant to seek and receive an exemption, which it did. And it is one of the lowest in the region at about 15% intensification and 30 to 35 people plus jobs per hectare in the greenfield area. Now, these are all part of the same watershed area, so the physical geography is not that dissimilar. They both have urbanized areas and very rural areas, but in fact, they have opted for these very, very different targets. And at present, the reasons for these different targets can only be described as opaque. Another thing we found were differences in implementation guidelines. And this is one example. So the growth plan anticipates that in planning for greenfield development, municipalities will have to exclude certain kinds of lands. Most of these are environmentally sensitive lands, provincially significant wetlands, and so forth, floodplains. They have to be excluded. So what this affects is the denominator, so to speak. So if you're planning for people plus jobs per hectare, you can reduce the number of hectares by taking out land that is unsuitable for development. Now, traditionally, many municipalities have planned other lands or taken out other lands from that calculation, such as, say, cemeteries or hydro corridors or even golf courses, although indeed golf courses sometimes do get developed. And many of them have asked permission to exclude those as well. So you take out more land, and the number of hectares becomes smaller. And so, as you reduce the number in the denominator, the apparent density of the same number of people in both cases seems higher. So on the left, if you put a certain number of people on that land, and you take out only the lands that are specified in the growth plan, you get 23 people and jobs per hectare. On the right, you can put the same number of people on the same gross amount of land, but you get a much higher apparent density. And this becomes very important because these targets do have real force. And if you can argue, look, we are meeting our targets, we are putting 50 people and jobs on this piece of land, and oh gosh, we've run out of land, we'll have to designate some more. So it's possible that these additional implementation effects, which are not in the growth plan itself, but are in fact being used by certain municipalities, could undermine some of the efforts. The cumulative effect of a lot of these changes and exemptions and exceptions and differences in implementation is to create a really sharp division between the inner and the outer ring. Probably wasn't intended to be quite so sharp. These two show on the left, the people and jobs projections. So about 75% of the projected people and jobs going to the inner ring, about 25% to the outer ring. And that breaks down to the inner ring is getting about 3 times the number of people and about 4 times the number of jobs as the outer ring. And yet on the right, if you look and see the amount of land that's being designated, there's not as much difference as you might expect because of these allowances for lower levels of intensification and lower densities on the greenfield area as it's developed. This is a gross density forecast. Now, it is a forecast. This is calculated if municipalities develop with the assigned population and employment at the intensification levels and greenfield density levels to which they have committed on the land they have designated, so a lot of ifs. This is what we're going to see in 2031. So there will be a bit of an uptick in density in the inner ring, a decrease in density in the outer ring, and all over, not much difference. Of course, developing areas increase in density anyway over time, naturally, so it represents really not much difference at all. There's a little dashed line at the top that shows you that is the 50 people and jobs per hectare considered to be a minimum for transit provision. So we're not making as much progress, but this, as I say, is just a forecast that if we do exactly what we say we're going to do on the amount of land that we have designated, that's what we can expect to see. Finally, there's the question of the rural settlement area, and it is a question. We haven't quite figured this one out yet. If you go on the GeoWeb, and I hope you will go on the GeoWeb, you will see that these little spots, we call this the acne map. It's sort of just little dots all over the place. These little spots actually have 2 colors. So there's the color of these are hamlets and villages in the rural areas. You can see many of them are right in the green belt. So we calculated the area of them as of 2006, and then there were expansion areas allowed. And we calculated that too, and they're shown in different colors on the GeoWeb, so you can really see where rural areas plan to expand and how much. We did not add this to our overall calculation, but the total amount of land involved is about 47,000 hectares. It plays out in odd ways. Here's Acton and Bannockburn. These are in Halton Hills and Halton Region, and they are in the Greenbelt. Acton is considered urban, so the rules that apply to Acton are pretty clear. Bannockburn, which is just a few fields distance away, is considered rural, and it's not so clear. The growth plan says that it will treat rural areas as if they were designated greenfield areas, so they have to meet a density target in their area. But the document establishing the built boundary used slightly different terminology and referred to them as let me get this right, undelineated built-up areas, which sounds a bit of an oxymoron. If it's built-up area, then you can delineate it, but it's undelineated built-up area. So they are in a bit of a policy limbo. It's not clear what approaches are to be applied in the rural area. So those are the 5 points that we're throwing out for discussion today. There's a lot more in the report and a lot more that can be discussed. But I think I'll hand it back to Marcy now.
Thanks, Phil. So I think if we these are sort of the 4 key questions that I think would be great to spark some discussion on. And I think the first one is relevant to, if we really want to truly change growth patterns, what can we do to make the designated land last longer than and beyond 2031? And we think there's an opportunity to make this land base last longer through the implementation of Amendment 2 of the growth plan, that is the population and employment forecast to 2041. Our study shows that there really is no need for more land to be designated. And perhaps instead we should use more strategic policies that direct growth to areas with existing infrastructure capacity. And as part of the strategy, maybe we should look at other tools, such as full cost pricing for servicing land, to make our land base last a little bit longer. This also leads to the question of do our current and proposed investments in infrastructure align with where the growth is going, as seen in some of the maps that we showed. Currently, there's no deliberate alignment between the projects in the big move, a $50 billion investment, and where the growth plan is allocating growth. And finally, a fair question to ask, in its present form, does the growth plan actually reduce or augment municipal infrastructure deficits? So from a big picture view, what is the current capacity? You know, maybe we should ask ourselves, what's the current capacity of water and wastewater servicing systems in our region? Does the plan's allocation of people and jobs take advantage of existing infrastructure or require more investment made by municipalities who are already or will in future be overburdened by infrastructure debt? The plan contemplated sub-area assessments and capacity studies that were never done, and such large-scale regional studies could better inform what the effectiveness of the growth plan policies are. So I'm going to leave you finally with a graphic that I think many people are familiar with. These are footprints and metrics that come from our metropolitan poster that compares density, population, and roads density, urban form, and modal split. So in black you see the use of the car use, auto use essentially, and in red you see usage of transit, walking, cycling, all grouped together in the pie chart. On the left are American cities, Atlanta and Chicago. In the middle is Toronto, and on the right you see European cities. And what this shows, and what our poster shows, is Canadian cities sit smack dab in the middle of these 2 approaches to growth. So I think we have a choice. You know, what will our future city region look like? The American model or the European model of growth management? So I'll leave it at that.